Tulasi Krishna Prayasi Namo Namaha. Radha Krishna Seva Pabo Abhilashi Jitomar Sharan Lo Tara Vancha Purna Ho Kripa Kori Karo Tare Vrindavan Vasi Morae Abhila Vilas Kunje Diyova Nayane Haribo Sada Jugal Ruparasi Ei Nivedana Dharo Sakiranugata Karo Sevadhikara Diye Karo Nijadasi Dina Krishna Dase Ko Ye Namora Shri Radha Govinda Preme Sadayena Bhasi Yani Kani Chapapani Brahma Hatyadikani Cha Tani Tani Pranashanti Pradakshina Pade Pade Yani Kani Chapapani Brahma Hatyadikani Cha Tani Tani Pranashanti Pradakshina Pade Pade Yani Kani Chapapani Brahma Hatyadikani Cha Tani Tani Pranashanti Pradakshina Pade Pade Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Jaya Tulsi Maharani, Jaya Vrinde Devi, Tulsi Maharani, Jaya Vrinde Devi. वृंदाय तुलसी देव प्रियाय केशव सचा कृष्ण भक्ति देवी सत्यवते नमो नमः वृंदाय तुलसी देव प्रियाय केशव सचा कृष्ण भक्ति देवी सत्यवते नमो नमः वृंदाय तुलसी देव प्रियाय केशव सचा कृष्ण भक्ति देवी सत्यवते नमो नमः इंग्लिश यस Prabhupada? Yes, man. Chapter 1.
Srila Prabhupada's lonely struggle, attempting to preach the message of Lord Krishna. After adopting the renounced order of Vanaprastha Ashram in the year 1954, Srila Prabhupada left behind his family members, his business and his home to embark on a life dedicated to fulfilling the order of his spiritual master, which was to preach the message of Lord Krishna in the English language and specifically to the people of the Western world. Although it was certainly very painful for Srila Prabhupada to leave his wife and children, after reaching the age of 58, he firmly believed that fulfilling the order of his spiritual master and taking Lord Krishna's message contained in the Bhagavad Gita and the Srimad Bhagavatam to the people of the Western world would be far more beneficial to the human race than to remain at home, caring only for his family members. In India's ancient Vedic culture, a man is not expected to remain throughout his life in the comfort of his home, surrounded by his wife and children, and instead, after the age of 50, a man is required to retire from all material activities and go to the forest or an ashram to practice yoga and meditation and cultivate pure devotional to the Supreme Lord in preparation for his ultimate death. The Vedic scriptures declare that by taking to the path of renunciation and the practice of devotional service, a person can do far more good, not only for himself and his family, but for the whole of human society. By becoming a pure devotee of the Lord and achieving liberation,
Yeah.
a man automatically achieves liberation for all his family members, who at the time of their death share the results of his spiritual achievements. From the very first meeting with his spiritual master, Srila Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Goswami, at the Gaudiya Math temple in Calcutta in 1922, due to his being a well educated young man, Saraswati Goswami asked him to spread the transcendental teachings of Lord Krishna as enunciated by the golden avatar Sri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu amongst the English speaking people of the world. After taking formal initiation from Srila Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati in 1933, Srila Prabhupada contributed many articles to various publications of the Gaudiya Math. The mission established by Saraswati Goswami that had over 60 temples around India. After reading some of these articles written by Srila Prabhupada and being highly impressed by the erudite and scholarly content of the articles, Saraswati Goswami ordered his editors to print every single article sent to them by Srila Prabhupada. When on one occasion his disciples were eulogizing Srila Prabhupada's scholarship, his Sanskrit erudition, and his extraordinary devotional qualities, Saraswati Goswami told them, "You do not need to recommend him. I have already marked him out," adding that in the future he will do everything. In 1939, due to his profound Vedic scholarship, Srila Prabhupada was honored by the Gaudiya Vaishnava Society with the title Bhakti Vedant, one of the highest epithets of a Vaishnava scholar can receive. By the year 1944, besides writing innumerable articles and essays, Srila Prabhupada had also completed an English commentary on the Bhagavad Gita entitled Gita and had also started his own monthly magazine in English, which he called Back to Godhead. Unfortunately, after just two editions, he was unable to continue due to the high cost of printing, as paper was expensive at that time and in very short supply due to rationing. The Back to Godhead magazine again reappeared for a brief period in 1952, but then once again, due to the paucity of funds, it could not be continued. However, after retiring from family life and accepting Vanaprastha, Srila Prabhupada once again revived Back to Godhead, this time from Delhi, and it became one of the important mainstays of his future preaching activities. Preaching in Jhansi. In October 1952, 2 years before accepting Vanaprastha ashram, while still running his pharmaceutical business from Allahabad, Srila Prabhupada was invited by some of his business acquaintances to lecture at the Gita Mandir in Jhansi, Madhya Pradesh. The lecture was very much appreciated, and a number of local people, plus some of educated young men from the city, requested Srila Prabhupada to start a society in Jhansi for spreading the message of Lord Chaitanya's Sankirtan movement and the teachings of the Bhagavad Gita. On May 16, 1953, Srila Prabhupada established a society under the name League of Devotees from a rented building known as Bharati Bhavan, located on the outskirts of the Jhansi. And from this place, Srila Prabhupada
पेपर पेन से लीजिए कॉपी पेन जो बोलेंगे लिखने की लिखने का है पेन ले लीजिए बोलेंगे फिर लिखने के लिए, वो लिखने का ध्यान दो।
अब बता दीजिएगा ना जब लिखना। On May 16, 1953, Srila Prabhupada established a society under the name League of Devotees from a rented building known as Bharati Bhavan, located on the outskirts of the Jhansi. And from this place, Srila Prabhupada began to teach the articulate and educated young men of the city about pure Krishna consciousness. One of the young gentlemen who joined the league was 25-year-old Dr. Prabhakar Mishra, the principal of the Vedanta Sanskrit College, who later became Srila Prabhupada's first ever disciple. Over the next year or so, Srila Prabhupada divided his time between his preaching center in Jhansi, running his pharmaceutical business in Allahabad, and taking care of his family. However, in 1954, feeling it was his duty to dedicate the remainder of his life to spreading the message of Godhead, Srila Prabhupada closed his pharmaceutical business and left home, adopting the renounced Varnaprastha order of life so that he could fulfill the order given to him by his spiritual master to preach the message of Lord Krishna in the English language to the people of the world. After having made a very successful start in Jhansi, and the building that Srila Prabhupada's League of Devotees was using was commanded by the wife of Madhya Pradesh state governor for the purpose of running a ladies organization known as the Mahila Samiti. And as she had powerful political connections, Srila Prabhupada was forced to close down the League of Devotees and move out. Nevertheless, Srila Prabhupada had gained valuable experience during the period that he ran the fledgling League of Devotees, and it was certainly a precursor to his later success when some 11 years later he would travel to New York City in the USA and establish the International Society for Krishna Consciousness. After being forced to leave the Jhansi center in early months of 1955, Srila Prabhupada went to Mathura, where his sannyasi god brother and close friend Keshav Maharaj had just opened a branch of the Gaudiya Mutt. Srila Prabhupada lived in the Mutt for a few months and spent his time editing the Mutt's journal, the Gaudiya Patrika, and assisted in the training of the young brahmachari disciples of Keshav Maharaj. Srila Prabhupada arrives in Delhi. In July of 1955, Srila Prabhupada received an invitation from one of his sannyasi god brothers, Bhakti Sarang Goswami Maharaj, the president of the Delhi branch of the Gaudiya Mutt, located in Karol Bagh's Chauri Bazar and known locally as the Gaudiya Sangh. Bhakti Sarang Maharaj, being well aware of Srila Prabhupada's erudite scholarship and proficiency in Sanskrit, wanted Srila Prabhupada to join his Delhi Mutt and become the editor of the Mutt's monthly journal called Sajjan Toshini. The Sajjan Toshini was originally known as the Harmonist and had been an English language publication established by the great Vaishnava Acharya Srila Bhakti Vinod Thakur, the father of Srila Prabhupada's own spiritual master, and therefore Srila Prabhupada felt very enthusiastic about the proposal. He could take up this very important assignment as editor of the Sajjan Toshini and still continue to edit the Mathura Mutt's Gaudiya Patrika from Delhi. After moving to Delhi, besides editing the Sajjan Toshini, Bhakti Sarang Maharaj also asked Srila Prabhupada to manage the Mutt while he was away from Delhi on a prolonged visit to Navdeep in West Bengal. Srila Prabhupada soon discovered that the Mutt had no typewriter for writing or editing articles, and that the Mutt's devotees were extremely lazy and uncooperative. Furthermore, there was an acute shortage of funds, and the printers were not on good terms with Bhakti Sarang Maharaj due to non-payment of bills for the previous edition of Sajjan Toshini. However, regardless of all these drawbacks, Srila Prabhupada was able to produce the August edition of Sajjan Toshini. Taking the work of writing articles, editing and printing Sajjan Toshini very seriously, Srila Prabhupada wanted to improve the quality of the journal on the lines of the Illustrated Weekly of India and the famous Time magazine of the USA. Srila Prabhupada also wanted to double the number of copies for the September issue of Sajjan Toshni. That could be accomplished at no extra cost. Srila Prabhupada wrote to Bhakti Sarang Maharaj, but unfortunately his idea was not well received by Bhakti Sarang, who wrote back saying he did not want any increase in the number of copies during his stay in the mutt for the benefit of the Hindi speaking people of Delhi, including the many regular visitors to the mutt. Srila Prabhupada began translating the first ever Hindi language version of the Bengali classic Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita and wrote requesting Bhakti Sarang Maharaj for a loan of 600 rupees in order to publish the first few chapters of the translation. However, Bhakti Sarang Maharaj, who was still in Navdeep, was not very favorable to this idea. In a letter sent to Srila Prabhupada by Bhakti Sarang Maharaj's secretary, Srila Prabhupada was unceremoniously relieved of his editorial duties and requested to leave the mutt as soon as possible. Homeless in Delhi. Having been abruptly forced to leave the Gaudiya Mutt, Srila Prabhupada found himself on the streets of Delhi, penniless and without any place to stay. Out of their kindness, a number of Delhi's residents who had met Srila Prabhupada during his short stay in the city came forward to provide him with both food and shelter. They were of the opinion that Srila Prabhupada was a genuine sadhu, as well as an erudite Vedic scholar. And being religious minded Hindus, they felt privileged that they could offer their help to such a noble and saintly person. In this way, Srila Prabhupada would spend a few days at one gentleman's residence and then a few more days at another's, and in this way he managed to survive. During this difficult period, regardless of his almost penniless and homeless existence, Srila Prabhupada continued preaching Lord Krishna's transcendental message wherever he went and also continued to write articles whenever he got the chance. During this trying time, he also spent a number of days staying in a room at the Kapoor College of Commerce. And on another occasion, he spent a few days in a room at a local Vishnu temple. Srila Prabhupada continued to receive support from the pious people of Delhi, and thanks to them, he managed to survive what was the most testing time of his entire life. Those early days in Delhi was extremely difficult, and it was certainly a very severe test for his faith and determination to fulfill the order of his spiritual master. Despite the many reversals that he had to face, Srila Prabhupada's faith in Lord Krishna did not diminish even slightly, but instead it increased dramatically because he knew that it was only by the Lord's special mercy that he was able to continue with his preaching mission due to the help provided by the pious people of Delhi. Undaunted by his near beggarly existence, Srila Prabhupada, always remembering the order of his Guru Maharaj, continued to write articles and essays in English and was always enthusiastic to preach about Krishna consciousness to anyone who was eager to listen. All those who heard Srila Prabhupada speak on the philosophy of the Gita and the Bhagavatam were greatly impressed by his deep understanding of the subject, his knowledge of Sanskrit, his scholastic presentation, and his absolute faith in Guru and Krishna. Revival of Back to Godhead magazine. Srila Prabhupada, who was always brimming with enthusiasm to preach, would regularly visit many of Delhi's leading businessmen, industrialists, educators, religious leaders, judges, lawyers, government officials, and a host of political luminaries in the hope of convincing them about the importance of spreading India's Vedic culture not only in India but more importantly all over the world. Srila Prabhupada also attempted to garner donations from these gentlemen for printing books and for restarting his magazine Back to Godhead. The Vedas say that it is the duty of all sadhus and holy men to engage the common man in works of religious merit. like publishing books and building temples. This not only helps to spread the glories of the Supreme Lord, but greatly benefits the donors and the people in general, and is one of the few ways in which wealthy materialistic people can be engaged in religious acts. In olden days, most Indians were eager to give donations to sadhus in order to purify themselves from the sinful contaminations of materialistic life and to make advancement on the path back to Godhead. It was quite common for very wealthy persons to print hundreds of copies of books like the Bhagavad Gita and distribute them freely amongst the masses. Although India was changing due to the influence of gross
644 से
materialism
8 बज के 9
and
मिनट
the people were becoming eager to amass
644
great
to 809
personal wealth, nevertheless, Srila Prabhupada always tried to engage everyone he met in serving the mission of spreading Lord Krishna's transcendental message. Over the next 4 months, Srila Prabhupada's undying desire to continue to preach regardless of his personal difficulties, eventually began to bear fruit. With the support of some very favorable trustees of the Birla Mandir, Srila Prabhupada was able to organize a public gathering at the trust's famous Lakshmi Narayan Mandir in Delhi on December 22nd, 1955, which Srila Prabhupada advertised in the Hindustan Times. The meeting was presided over by the then President of Delhi Municipal Committee, Mr. R. N. Agarwal, and was attended by many respectable gentlemen of Delhi. All those in attendance appreciated the scholarly discourse given by Srila Prabhupada, in which he discussed Vedic philosophy and the great relevance in today's world of scriptures like Bhagavad Gita and Srimad Bhagavatam. Because of the successful program held at the Birla Mandir, Srila Prabhupada had managed to raise sufficient donations to again publish his Back to Godhead magazine. During the chilly winter mornings of January 1956, without a chadar or any warm clothing, wearing just a thin cotton jacket and cotton hat without taking any breakfast, Srila Prabhupada walked all the way to the printers in Old Delhi rather than take a bus or rickshaw in order to save money, and would spend the morning hours checking the proofs of the magazine and making the necessary corrections. The proprietor of the press, Surinder Kumar Jain, was amazed at the austerity Srila Prabhupada underwent in order to print his Back to Godhead magazine and his unflinching enthusiasm to preach the message of Godhead. He saw that Srila Prabhupada had very little money, but whatever he did collect by way of donations, he never wasted it on his own needs, but would instead spend every penny for printing his Back to Godhead magazine. Knowing that Srila Prabhupada was not taking any breakfast, Mr. Jain would arrange a little breakfast to be brought from his house, which Srila Prabhupada graciously accepted while reading through the proofs of his magazine. Surinder Kumar Jain. My first impression was that he was a nice person and straightforward. I felt pity also because of the conditions under which he would come. I know he didn't have even 25 paisa. He would come all the way on foot and without any breakfast or anything. He would come in the morning to the press, and when I would ask him, Swamiji, did you have anything to eat this morning? He would say, oh no, Mr. Jain, I just came because I had to see the proofs. That's all right, I would say. I will get breakfast for you. I would call for breakfast and then he would sit and work. He would do the proofreading himself. The printing was done by me, and most of the time he would like to be present when that final printing was being done. He would come in the morning around 7 and stay until he had seen all the proofs. It was a regular thing that he would come without breakfast. I would arrange for breakfast, and we would sit across the table from one another for hours together. He was always talking on religious subjects only, but when we would be sitting, especially when waiting for the to come, we would discuss many things. I felt that he knew quite a lot because he was a well read person. He was more a friend than just a person coming to get things printed. He was a very simple man, straightforward in his habits, but his mission at that time was particularly to further the movement of back to Godhead. His financial condition was very weak. Sometimes the printing would be very difficult because he was not able to arrange for the paper. Many times I told him that if he was feeling difficulty, why was he continuing? But he said, no, it is my mission and I will always carry it on as far as possible. I tried to accommodate him to the maximum possible extent, but he was a real pauper. I only did the printing and he had to arrange for the paper. So sometimes it was delayed. Although my job was printing, sometimes I would say, alright, you are so keen, I will give you the paper. But usually he would arrange for it himself since we only did printing. He would bring it in a rickshaw. We were not uncomfortable together, but as business would have it. If the bills were standing for a long time, then I would ask him if he could do something about it. He would say, don't worry, you can be sure that your money is coming. I never asked him where his funds were coming from because I felt that it was his personal matter, but it was embarrassing for him when he could not pay. So I never tried to embarrass him. He was concerned that if he didn't have money, how could he print the paper? And he definitely wanted to run that paper. He wanted to preach the teachings of the Gita. He thought of it as a sort of movement, that it was the only way that people in the world could find peace. His conviction was very strong. During the year 1956, Srila Prabhupada was producing Back to Godhead magazine on a regular basis thanks to the contributions he received from the pious and religious minded people of Delhi. Srila Prabhupada would personally distribute the copies of Back to Godhead, firstly to the various donors who contributed to the printing and then on the streets of Delhi, as well as to shopkeepers, business establishments, and to various offices located around the city center. On some occasions, although he never touched tea himself, being a strict Vaishnava, he would visit the many tea shops where office workers and government servants would congregate during their break and distribute his Back to Godhead magazines amongst them. Srila Prabhupada would also mail out copies of the magazine to friends, acquaintances, and prospective donors in different parts of India. Although it began as a simple 4-page pamphlet style magazine containing articles and essays written exclusively by Srila Prabhupada, the importance of the Back to Godhead magazine could never be minimized on the grounds that it was just a magazine. It was, in fact, an important introduction to Krishna consciousness for hundreds and thousands of people who would otherwise never have read books like the Bhagavad Gita or Srimad Bhagavatam. In the Western world, when Back to Godhead was first published there, it gained the status of a new age magazine, and its sales worldwide eventually reached a staggering 1 million copies every month, spreading Krishna's message in Delhi. Having surmounted the difficulties of his first year in the capital, although still without any fixed abode, Srila Prabhupada had already achieved considerable success in his preaching and was now producing a monthly edition of Back to Godhead magazine. On November 21st, 1956, Srila Prabhupada sent all the previously printed editions of the magazine to Dr. Rajendra Prasad, the then President of India, along with a letter requesting him to at least read the headlines of the magazine, which concerned the decline of spiritual values amongst the general population. Srila Prabhupada also requested Dr. Rajendra Prasad to grant him an interview so they could discuss the propagation of India's spiritual heritage amongst the citizens of India. Unfortunately, there was no response to Srila Prabhupada's letter. A friend and well-wisher of Srila Prabhupada and one of the donors of Back to Godhead magazine, the former High Court Judge Justice Vipin Chandra Mishra, once said that he did not think that Srila Prabhupada would have much of an impact on the people of Delhi because he chose to preach and write in English rather than in Hindi, the local language of most Delhites. Justice Mishra. He used to come to me at once a month. I gave him donations for his paper. It was only a 4-page magazine, but it showed his study of the subject and his earnestness and his devotion to Lord Krishna. He appeared to be a very simple man and modest, and it was pleasant to talk to him. He had a smiling demeanor. The main thing was his humility. He could talk with affection and confidence, and he knew we were discussing things near to God. So every talk with him would sublimate us. I was a rather important personality at that time in religious affairs, but he would not be expected to make any contribution to the main religious life of Delhi at that time because of the language difficulty, because his aim was to reach the English educated persons, not the Hindi ones, and also because his means and his popularity were not at all established. The magazine did not have a wide appeal among these people. Other religious leaders were all well established. The only thing that impressed one and was worth noticing at that time was the simplicity of his abiding faith in God's name and his mission. Srila Prabhupada had received the order from his spiritual master to preach in the English language, and although it was certainly very difficult in a Hindi speaking city, he was duty bound to preserve and continue his efforts to propagate Lord Krishna's message by writing in English. Although Justice Mishra had long since passed on, he would certainly have been surprised not only at the great success that Srila Prabhupada eventually achieved, but also how many millions of Indians, and in particular Delites, are today speaking and reading in the English language. In fact, all higher education in India is now predominantly conducted in the English language. Regardless of whatever negative responses he might have received, undaunted, Srila Prabhupada continued with his mission to preach Lord Krishna's message in the English language and continued to produce his monthly magazine Back to Godhead. On one occasion, while out distributing his Back to Godhead magazines on the streets of Delhi, Srila Prabhupada was gored and knocked to the ground by a rampaging cow and was forced to take bed rest. However, within days, he was back on the streets on distributing his magazines just as before. On another occasion, later that same year, during the intense summer heat that afflicts Delhi, with temperatures hovering around 44 degrees centigrade, Srila Prabhupada began to feel suddenly very weak and dizzy and was on the verge of collapsing in the street due to the effects of heat stroke. Fortunately, at that very moment, one of the regular donors of the Back to Godhead magazine, who knew Srila Prabhupada, was passing by in his car and seeing that Srila Prabhupada was experiencing some difficulty, took him in his car and drove him to the nearest doctor. After thoroughly checking Srila Prabhupada, the doctor advised him to take rest for a number of days. But as soon as Srila Prabhupada had recovered sufficiently, he was back on the streets of Delhi distributing his Back to Godhead magazines once again. The many reversals and hardships that Srila Prabhupada had faced since accepting Vanprastha certainly tested his resolve and determination to continue preaching the message of Lord Krishna. However, these same reversals and hardships would ultimately prepare Srila Prabhupada for the future, when he would have to endure the loneliness of living in a foreign land amid the inhospitable people of a highly materialistic and morally decadent culture. What to speak of the surviving the freezing cold winters of New York City with its bitingly cold winds, snow and ice when in the future he would arrive in the shores of America where his great test still awaited him. Finding refuge in Vrindavan. Towards the end of 1956, Srila Prabhupada visited the holy city of Vrindavan, and by Lord Krishna's mercy, the Mahant of the Vamsi Gopal Mandir, whom Srila Prabhupada had first met on a previous visit to Vrindavan in 1953, offered Srila Prabhupada a permanent residence in a first floor room at the Vamsi Gopal Mandir. The temple was located near Keshi Ghat, just a few minutes walk from the medieval temples of Radha Gokulanandan, Radha Raman, and Radha Gopinath. It was the perfect place for Srila Prabhupada to find a permanent refuge. Srila Prabhupada had visited Vrindavan on a number of previous occasions, starting in 1925 with his family, and then again in 1932, where he met his spiritual master Srila Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Goswami at Kosi during the Gaudiya Math's annual Vraj Mandal Parikrama. Then again in 1935, he had met Srila Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati for the very last time at Radha Kund, just 1 year before his spiritual master disappeared from the world. During that last meeting, his spiritual master advised him that if he ever got sufficient funds, he should print books rather than build temples, as books had a far greater impact on the population and was the most effective way of spreading the teachings of Lord Krishna. On December 13th, 1936, just 18 days before his disappearance from the world,
Yes, ma'am.
ट्रीट करते
Yes, ma'am. On December 13th, 1936, just 18 days before his disappearance from the world, Srila Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati wrote a letter to Srila Prabhupada, asking him to preach the message of Sri Lord Chaitanya in the English language. This was the final order that Srila Prabhupada received from his spiritual master. It confirmed all the previous instructions he had received about preaching in the English language, starting from their very first meeting in 1922. Although Srila Prabhupada had now found a permanent residence in Vrindavan, nevertheless, he continued to travel by the early morning train to Delhi, where he continued with his preaching work, distributing his Back to Godhead magazine and raising funds for printing further editions of the magazine. Srila Prabhupada would either spend the night in Delhi or return to Vrindavan by the evening train. However, by January 1957, having successfully printed over 12 consecutive editions of his Back to Godhead magazine, Srila Prabhupada had run out of funds and unable to find another donor, he was forced to stop further printing. Being unable to continue Back to Godhead magazine, Srila Prabhupada decided to remain in Vrindavan and concentrate on his writing. Thus, in order to sustain his simple existence, Srila Prabhupada performed the age-old tradition amongst mendicants known as Madhukari. The performance of Madhukari, which literally means collecting honey like a bee from flower to flower, is a spiritual practice undertaken by holy men for maintaining the body and soul. The practice also involves the development of humility by begging alms from door to door and accepting only a small amount of from each house so that nobody is burdened. The householders would usually give chapatis or raw flour, rice, and lentils, which the holy men would either soak in water or cook on a fire. This practice is ordained in the Vedic scriptures for all the mendicants, including brahmacharis, vanpras, and sannyasis. Each morning, Srila Prabhupada, while carrying his small begging bowl and his umbrella, would take first darshan at the Radha Damodar and then, after performing Madhukari, would go for darshan to Radha Raman Mandir and then chant japa while sitting beside the samadhi of Gopal Bhatt Goswami. He would then return to Vanshi Gopal Mandir just before noon to honor the prasadam that he had received while performing Madhukari. During the next 2 years, from 1957, Srila Prabhupada continued to write articles as well as prepare manuscripts for future books. He would also go on parikrama to the various temples of Vrindavan, both morning and evening. Life in Vrindavan was very peaceful and so also spiritually rejuvenating, especially after the severe hardships he had faced since accepting the Vanpras ashram. During this time, staying in Vrindavan Srila Prabhupada also received various invitations to attend preaching engagements in such places like Bombay, Kanpur, and Kurukshetra, which he had accepted and gave several discourses on Gita and Bhagavatam. Prabhupada writes to Jawaharlal Nehru. In the month of August 1958, Srila Prabhupada wrote a letter to the then Prime Minister of India, Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru, expressing concern that the people of India, under the leadership of the modern politicians, were rejecting their own spiritual culture and imitating the culture of the Europeans and Americans. Srila Prabhupada was familiar with Pandit Nehru and his family because the Nehru family hailed from Allahabad and had always purchased their medicines from the pharmacy owned by Srila Prabhupada when he was a businessman in his householder days at Allahabad. In the letter, Srila Prabhupada glorified the ideal life epitomized by such leaders like Mahatma Gandhi and Chanakya Pandit, who lived very simply and promoted Vedic culture. Srila Prabhupada proposed to Nehru that it was the
साफ
responsibility
चादर बिछा दो इसके ऊपर साफ चादर
it was the responsibility of the leaders to guide the masses on the path of spiritualism, as Mahatma Gandhi had tried to do. However, there was no reply from Nehru. Unfortunately, Pandit Nehru and his fellow political leaders had already decided to lead India down to the path of westernized materialism that included massive industrialization of the country. In one of his well known speeches, Nehru had boldly declared that the factories would be the new temples of modern India. It was Mahatma Gandhi who had led India to independence and had envisioned that once the British were out of India, there could be a spiritual revival of Vedic culture in the country and the Bhagavad Gita, of which the Mahatma was devout follower, could be taught in all the schools across the subcontinent. He had also said that there should be a temple built in every single village of India to help the revival of spiritualism and Indian culture, and that economic development should start from the village level and Indian culture in order to bring relief to the suffering masses of India. Unfortunately, for Mahatma Gandhi as well as Indian religion and culture, Nehru and his supporters never intended to fulfill Gandhiji's desire for the spiritual upliftment of India. During the period of his stay in Vrindavan, Srila Prabhupada continued to regularly visit Delhi to continue with his preaching work in the capital. On one such visit to Delhi in October 1958, he received a generous donation from a pious city businessman for printing Back to Godhead magazine. He, he therefore immediately printed 1000 copies for an October edition, the first edition to appear in almost 2 years, and then personally distributed all the copies himself. After the success of the October edition, Srila Prabhupada received yet another donation for the November issue, which he immediately printed and distributed himself. After printing those two editions, Srila Prabhupada was unable to raise further donations, and therefore, during the next 6 months, Srila Prabhupada mostly stayed in Vrindavan. In July 1959, the Mahant of the Radha Damodar Mandir in Vrindavan informed Srila Prabhupada that he had some vacant rooms and invited him to stay there. Srila Prabhupada considered that the chance to stay at the Radha Damodar Mandir was most auspicious because the Radha Damodar Mandir had been established by Srila Jeev Goswami and was the place where Srila Rup Goswami had written many of his important books, including the Bhakti Rasamrit Sindhu. This ancient temple had also been Rup Goswami's spiritual headquarters for spreading Lord Chaitanya's Sankirtan movement, and the place where the 6 Goswamis of Vrindavan would regularly meet to discuss transcendental topics. Srila Prabhupada believed it was the ideal place for him to reside and write his English translation of the Srimad Bhagavatam. without hesitation and looking forward to living in the close association of both Roop and Son and G. Goswami, Srila Prabhupada immediately accepted the offer to move his residence to the Radha Damodar Mandir. Prabhupada takes sannyas. One night, while asleep in his room at the Radha Damodar Mandir, Srila Prabhupada had an amazing dream. It was the same dream he had earlier in his life, just after the first meeting with his spiritual master in 1922. In the dream, Srila Prabhupada suddenly saw the tall and effulgent figure of his spiritual master, Srila Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Goswami, descending from the spiritual world and calling Srila Prabhupada to follow him. Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati was repeatedly calling him to follow in his footsteps and become a sannyasi. On walking from the dream, Srila Prabhupada felt ecstatic and realized that his spiritual master had personally appeared before him, giving him direct instructions to take sannyas. It was the same dream he had seen on two previous occasions when he was a newly married young man with a family to look after. But at that time, Srila Prabhupada had been horrified at the thought of having to leave his young wife and small children behind in order to live the renounced and austere life of a sannyasi. But now things had changed. The idea of taking sannyas now seemed to be a very good idea. He felt extremely blessed that his spiritual master had once again beckoned him to take sannyas. In the Gaudiya Vaishnava Sampradaya, to which Srila Prabhupada and his spiritual master both belong, acceptance of sannyas ashram is recommended for those who wish to preach the message of love of God amongst the innocent masses. The order of sannyas is the fourth and last stage in the Vedic religious system known as Varnashram Dharma. And Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, the golden avatar, also took sannyas in order to preach the divine message of love of God. Srila Prabhupada decided to accept the order of sannyas from one of his sannyasi god brothers, and after some deliberation, he informed his close friends at the Gaudiya Mutt in Mathura, Keshav Maharaj, about his intentions. Hearing about his dream, Keshav Maharaj told Srila Prabhupada to immediately take sannyas and also offered to initiate him into the renounced order of life. Thus, at the ceremony at the Mathura Gaudiya Mutt of September 17, 1959, Srila Prabhupada accepted the Tridandi sannyas order from his god brother Keshav Maharaj and was given the sannyas name A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami. At the time of birth in 1896, Srila Prabhupada's father gave him the name Abhay Charan, meaning fearless at the lotus feet of Krishna. At the time of initiation in 1933, Srila Bhakti Siddhanta Saraswati Swami gave him the name Abhay Charnaravinda Das. And in 1939, due to his profound Vedic scholarship, the Gaudiya Vaishnava Society awarded him the title Bhakti Vedant. After accepting the sannyas order from Keshav Maharaj, he was awarded the title Swami, thus becoming Abhay Charnaravinda Bhakti Vedanta Swami. A new chapter in Prabhupada's life. Sometime after taking sannyas, Srila Prabhupada happened to meet a librarian who advised him that it would be far better for him to publish books rather than magazines, as books lasted a very long time, whereas magazines are generally thrown away after having been read once. Around the same time, Srila Prabhupada also met an officer from the Indian Army who had been regularly reading Back to Godhead magazine, and he also advised Srila Prabhupada that it would be better to print books as they had a far greater value than magazines. Srila Prabhupada took this advice as the direct mercy of his spiritual master. Therefore, Srila Prabhupada decided to concentrate on writing and publishing books, even though books would be far more time consuming and certainly more costly to print than magazines. Srila Prabhupada decided that he would begin by writing the first ever English translation of the great Vedic classic Srimad Bhagavatam, which was considered to be the cream of all Vedic literature. The Bhagavatam was also Srila Vyasadev's own personal commentary on the famous Vedanta Sutra, the greatest ever treatise on Vedic philosophy. The Srimad Bhagavatam was without doubt the most important of all the Vedic literatures and was also revered by Lord Chaitanya Mahaprabhu, who declared it to be the spotless Puran. Lord Chaitanya had advised all Vaishnavas to study it daily in order to achieve God realization. In fact, the Bhagavatam is considered to be a literary incarnation of Lord Krishna, and by reading it under the guidance of a pure devotee, one automatically develops pure love of God. Srila Prabhupada concluded that it would be at least 60 volumes to produce the entire Bhagavatam in a thoroughly scholarship manner, with Sanskrit texts, English equivalents, and word for word synonyms, as well as his own elaborate purports. ISKCON's first office in Delhi. Srila Prabhupada continued to travel regularly to Delhi, sometimes staying overnight at the invitation of old friends and acquaintances. Then, by Lord Krishna's mercy, on one such visit, Srila Prabhupada had been invited to stay at the home of Mr. Hitcharan Sharma, the manager of Radha Press, where Srila Prabhupada had some years earlier printed pamphlets and leaflets on behalf of Jhansi's League of Devotees. Mr. Sharma introduced Srila Prabhupada to Pandit Krishna Sharma, a learned scholar, pious religionist, and the Mahant of the Sri Sri Radha Krishna temple in Old Delhi's Chippiwada area, which was located behind the famous Jama Masjid. Realizing that Srila Prabhupada was a very saintly person and also an erudite Vedic scholar, Sharmaji wanted to help Srila Prabhupada in his missionary activities and immediately offered Srila Prabhupada a permanent place to stay in Delhi, free of rent, in a room, the upper floor of the temple, to be used as an office and living quarters whenever Srila Prabhupada was visiting the city. Having obtained the office in Chippiwada at the end of 1959, Srila Prabhupada began his now famous translation of Srimad Bhagavatam and would spend long hours of the day and night engaging in typing the manuscript. Srila Prabhupada believed that the English edition of the Bhagavatam would form the spiritual and philosophical basis from which he would preach in America. And by selling these books, he could generate enough funds to support himself in America while he established his mission, which he planned to call the International Society for Krishna Consciousness. After taking sannyas, Srila Prabhupada's focus changed and he began to seriously think of going to America and establishing a worldwide spiritual organization devoted to spreading Krishna consciousness and propagating Lord Chaitanya's Sankirtan movement, which was based on the congregational chanting of Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare. Srila Prabhupada had formulated the name International Society for Krishna Consciousness based on Srila Rup Goswami's original idea while living at the Radha Damodar Mandir in Vrindavan. Srila Prabhupada had imbibed Srila Rup Goswami's conception of the integrated worldwide Vaishnava movement under the banner of Lord Chaitanya's Sankirtan movement. Thus, from his new office at the Radha Krishna Mandir, Srila Prabhupada embarked on a new phase in his life as he began to write the first ever English translation of Srimad Bhagavatam. It can therefore be said that Srila Prabhupada's office in Old Delhi's Chippiwada area, besides being a base in Delhi for printing his books and magazines, was in fact ISKCON's first de facto office. In 1960, Srila Prabhupada published his first ever book, a small paperback edition entitled Easy Journey to Other Planets. The publication of this book occurred after Srila Prabhupada had heard that two American scientists had received the Nobel Prize in Physics for discovering the antiproton. This discovery gave rise to speculation in scientific circles about an anti-material world, and coupled with the ongoing space race between the Americans and the Russians after the Russia had launched the world's first satellite called the Sputnik. The media was full of talk about the new frontiers of science and space exploration. Thus, feeling inspired, Srila Prabhupada began writing the book Easy Journey to Other Planets about the transcendental process of bhakti yoga and the ability of yogis to travel to other planets that included a description of the anti-material spiritual world called Vaikuntha. In August 1960, after raising sufficient donations, Srila Prabhupada published his Easy Journey to Other Planets as a paperback edition with a foreword by D.K. Siddhanta and then Vice Chancellor of Delhi University. After publication, Srila Prabhupada received a lot of very good reviews from a number of prominent scientists around India. It was a momentous occasion for Srila Prabhupada as it was the first complete book that he had ever published. When the same book, popularly known as The Easy Journey, was later reprinted in America in 1970, it was such a revelation that it created a sensation among the younger generations. After reading it, many Americans and Europeans became convinced about the authenticity and scientific basis of Bhakti Yoga, and many were converted to Krishna consciousness and joined Srila Prabhupada's ISKCON movement. During the year 1960, Srila Prabhupada was spending his time between Vrindavan and his Chippiwada office in Delhi. During this period, after receiving some donations from well-wishers, Srila Prabhupada once again began printing the Back to Godhead magazine and was also holding regular discourses on the Srimad Bhagavatam at the residence of Dr. Banerjee, a former director of the National Museum of India. Dr. Banerjee, he used to come to the library and consult some books, and I met him there. He gave me a book called Easy Journey.
रिबन लगा के रख हो गया पूछा पूछा लेके पूछा
आप बात करेंगे मैं बुलाऊँ आ जाएंगे पानी हाँ नेक्स्ट हाँ फिर करना
कहाँ जा रहा है?
कहीं नहीं जाना
अच्छा नहीं लग रहा था, हाँ? बेस्ट किया हुआ था हमने, अच्छा।
इसको तो रखने के लिए
ये रुमाल उठाओ, दे दो उधर। हाँ।
साफ नहीं है,
साफ साफ।
ठीक है हेलो
कृपा करी कर तारे वृंदावनवासी मोरे अभिलाष नयने हरियो सदा युगल रूपदा सखिरानंद करो शिवाय विकार दे